Well, kia ora, good afternoon. I'm Murray Bruges. I'm the director of the Helen Clark Foundation. Welcome to the second of a series of shorter form webinars our foundation is running on how New Zealand can confront its long-term issues despite an increasingly short-term focus in our politics. I gave the background to this series at the start of last webinar last week, so I'll keep it shorter today. In brief, this webinar series develops from a few beliefs we have here at the foundation. One, that well-designed policy is one of the most powerful levers a society has for making meaningful change. That and two, that New Zealand has been quite good at designing innovative, effective policy over much of our history. But just as importantly, that we've been good at maintaining at least some of that major policy across multiple changes of government, allowing these policies to have a meaningful impact on the day-to-day lives of New Zealanders. Some examples you often hear talked about here are ACC and Farm Act, for instance, which have been around for decades. And a third belief that informs this webinar series is that in recent decades, it's become increasingly common to see major public policies change when the government changes, which has made it harder for even the best designed policies to deliver meaningful positive change, especially on those longer term issues that our country faces in the 2020s and beyond, like responding to climate change, like providing for our aging population, improving economic productivity, housing affordability, among many others. So this webinar series is an opportunity to have experts reflect on how New Zealand can design and maintain effective public policy despite the unpredictable political environment of the 2020s in New Zealand and beyond. And beyond today's guest, we'll have a number of other ex-politicians and experts reflecting on those questions over the coming weeks, including Simon Bridges later in September. And we'll have some more announcements for other guests shortly. So with that, we're delighted to have financial journalist Liam Dann join us today. Liam is business editor at large at the New Zealand Herald, where he focuses on economic and financial journalism. I've always found Liam to be an incisive and engaging writer, adept at explaining the more impenetrable elements of monetary policy and the wider workings of the economy to the less financially literate among us. His regular column at the New Zealand Herald, Inside Economics, is a great explainer about what's going on in the world and what it means for New Zealand. It's well worth signing up for. So welcome, Liam.
Thanks, Murray. Kia ora.
And a reminder, we're trying shorter format webinars for this series. We got mostly positive feedback on the format for last week's discussion with Grant Robinson, so we'll keep today's session short as well. It's about 30 to 40 minutes. That should leave hopefully about 10 minutes at the end for some of your questions for Liam. So please do ask some concisely worded questions in the Q&A function, not the chat function, but the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen during the discussion. And if you see a question that you want answered in there, please give it a thumbs up rather than asking the same question. It just makes it easier for me to sort through those questions. So, Liam, can I ask you first to reflect on the premise that I started this webinar with? That is that while New Zealand has historically designed effective and enduring public policy, at least in some areas, that doing so has become harder in recent years. And if that is true, what do you think's changed that's made it harder?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with the premise. I think there's has been a real sense of policy, that there's some policy gridlock out there in terms of, like you just look at something like infrastructure, and the Infrastructure Council will tell you about the enormous billions of deficit we have in our infrastructure investment, and that's really about decision making and again, that long-term thinking. Politicians being able to put out a plan and get some consensus around it so that we don't flip-flop every 3, 6 or 9 years. I think there's also a bit of a global issue with the pace, the attention span of everybody and the pace. And so you do have politicians kind of and the political world trying to sort of second guess public opinion. That becomes, you get into territory where there's areas where they don't want to go at all. They don't want to talk about so okay, Labor's talking about capital gains tax now, but there are sort of some taboos around talking about tax and certain things that can't be cut, all that sort of stuff, because you get such instant public feedback and reaction. It's probably a lot more intense than it used to be. I know as a journalist, I get immediate feedback, so online, social media, comments on my articles. Someone used to have to go away and get a pen and paper and write a letter. They had to really care to do that. So, in a funny sort of way, my career is long enough that I've written commentary in that era when there wasn't the feedback. And look, I'm not saying feedback isn't great, but it is actually quite freeing to be able to not think about what just think about the issue and write what you want to write and not be thinking, oh, I know what the public's going to say about that. And I think that kind of second guessing goes through media, politics, and a whole bunch of social institutions these days.
Yeah, yeah. The pace of feedback and the quantity of it and the ease with which it's delivered is really increased in recent years. We see it here at the foundation, and I'm sure you'd see it a lot in a position like yours. To say nothing of our the ministers running the country. So zooming out, then, what do you see as the single most significant long-term challenge facing New Zealand over the next 30 years?
Yeah, I angsted a little bit about this question, knowing you were going to ask it, because in the real world, there's a whole bunch of complex, interconnected challenges. There's no question about that. But I think, well, I should admit, I asked AI what because AI can pull all the stuff I've written over the years, and it said what would Liam Dann say if and it said. Sort of was a very clear answer. It was productivity stagnation, which is really dry and boring. And I usually have to try and avoid the word productivity when I'm writing about it. So what I probably prefer to say is sort of wealth creation, and with a view to making more New Zealanders feel wealthy. So an inclusive kind of wealth creation that effectively for most New Zealanders just means getting real wages above the rate of inflation, which we haven't had for some time, so that there's a sense of a feeling that they're moving forward. I think that's crucial. So then all the other problems, and you look around the world, all the countries in the world are dealing with demographic problems. They've got cultural divides, varying degrees of assessing what to do with immigration, infrastructure investment, all that stuff. It's all a lot easier and more palatable to tackle if you've got some wealth underpinning things, and even to the extent of trying to deal with inequality, inequity. So I'd say wealth creation, and with a add on that it's about some inclusivity there, because obviously we don't want to just keep seeing more and more billionaires created.
Yeah, indeed. Any reflections on why that's been so challenging in New Zealand, and perhaps if you could dig into a little bit into why you find yourself reticent to talk about productivity in situations like this?
Yeah, well, first of all,
Is it seen as too dry or boring? What makes your audiences, less engaged in that
yeah,
topic?
I think the word is often seen as pretty dry. I mean, it's in economic terms, it's about the number of widgets that a worker can output in a certain period of time. But ultimately, it's about you want to see New Zealand workers producing, generating more wealth without having to just work harder to do it. So we've had this sort of productivity mystery. It's gone down over last few decades. You'd sort of think that the internet might have improved things. Didn't really seem to. There was productivity gains from the initial blush of computing getting taken on board in the 90s. But then, we just we've had this issue for so long that we've kind of identified all the problems, and I think I've got them written down. But I had it in my book. You can ask a politician, any politician, about the productivity challenge, and they'll jump straight in and they can list. I mean, streamlining regulations if you're on the right, better infrastructure, more entrepreneurialism, education, tax incentives. There's a whole list of things. They can reel them all off. So we don't, while it is a bit of a mystery why it's gone backwards. A lot of the answers are well known, and it's about actually physically taking the policy steps that we need to deal with them. And it probably, a lot of it may well start with education. But then, of course, you've got a big political divide on how we run our education system that can often mean flip-flopping back and forth. I think it's, a lot of those things feed into each other. My sort of issue for the last year or so has been really trying to up New Zealand's savings and investment rate, because I think, again, just when I look across at Australia, the pool of wealth they have helps them. I don't know that their productivity has been that much better. It has been better. I think they might be worrying about it going backwards at the moment. But effectively, they've got a much bigger buffer and a much more, a deeper well of capital to draw on for the kind of investment that drives productivity. So that gives them policy choices that maybe we haven't had.
Yeah, right. Well, I think perhaps that's a good place to dig in. One of the questions I was hoping we would get to today is the Australia-New Zealand comparison. You often write about it, and I've got a quote here from one of your recent articles. Quote, "I think we're falling behind because of bad policy, and I think we all need to save and invest more." So could you give us a bit more context to that? What bad policy are you thinking of there? Why have we not saved and invested more compared to Australia? And perhaps if you could start with, the compulsory retirement savings that exist in Australia, and how much capital has been amassed over the, I think, 30 odd years that they've had a system in place, or 40.
Yeah. I mean, they've got trillions. I can't remember the exact number in front of me, but trillions of dollars. I think it's like 3.4 or 4 trillion in their retirement savings, something like that. I mean, it's just, there's a very simple. When people say, why is Australia richer than New Zealand? It's a very simple reason that people have more money is that they save more money. So and I know there are reasons why some people can save more money, but there is an element of discipline, and then wealth creation creates more wealth. So investing money that and people can debate politically the large macro framework of the capitalist system we're in, but that is the system that we're living in, and in that system, saving and investing wealth does work. Like, the markets have generated, there's this incredible line of growth. If you look at, say, the S&P 500 over the last 100 years, the crashes are aberrations, and it's up multiple times. So that wealth creation thing works. In New Zealand, you can go back to 1972 to 75, I guess, and talk about we actually had plans for this for something ahead of Australia for a compulsory retirement thing. So the Labor government under Norm Kirk and Bill Rowling had a plan. It turned out not to be popular, or Rob Muldoon and the national government was able to they brought out the dancing Cossacks, and which always strikes me as strange, that they thought that Muldoon was saying this is communism by stealth. And I think one of the reasons for that might have been, I wasn't old enough to really know what was going on, although I'm old enough to remember the ads. But at that time, there was little vision for investing outside of New Zealand. Like, they couldn't really imagine. So if New Zealanders had just put all their money into a New Zealand investment fund, a government investment fund that only invested in New Zealand business, and then eventually that fund would end up owning all of New Zealand, and that was Rob Muldoon's premise, and that would be a government owning everything, and that would be communism. But it missed the point that Australia invests massively around the world. They don't just invest in Australia; that would be highly risky. But the dividends flow in, so they're gaining from investing in Apple and Nvidia and all that sort of stuff, as well as being able to invest in the kind of infrastructure projects, and the capital is there for things that are national good type things. And then, of course, Australia did it in I think it was 92 under Paul Keating, and that 30 plus years now has just proved to be a great success in terms of generating the capital, and also creating a depth in their financial sector. So I know you wanted to talk a little bit about Auckland. You look at Auckland's economy, we've really put the foot down on property, And that has, the property people get upset when I say it's not productive. There is a construction sector and a property services sector and all that sort of stuff, but the extra zeros on a residential house aren't productive. And also, it doesn't create financial services in Sydney and Melbourne is huge, and it's fed and underpinned by their own savings in a way that enables them to, for example, run their own banks, which we've got Kiwi Bank, but effectively we don't have the depth for banks that compete on their scale. But we could, and we could have a stronger financial services sector in Auckland that would make the Auckland economy stronger, or give it something to hang its hat on other than property. So all those benefits start to flow from it. So yeah, I would really like to see us tackle that policy. There'll be a debate about compulsion. I guess the Labour Party's thinking about their policy right now. You've got National Top or the Opportunity Party and New Zealand First all sort of saying that they would like to see it happen. ACT would always be opposed to it. And then I think there's a bit more consensus about gradually lifting the contribution rates of KiwiSaver, and that also would have great benefits. So we've got a good start there. It's just we could really put the foot down and give ourselves some real capital to play with in the next 20 years if we do that now.
Yeah, excellent. Well, I hope we can come back to Auckland and perhaps to the property market and the central role that plays in the New Zealand economy for whatever reason.
Sure.
But one thing we're keen to ask each of our guests is, what is a personal favorite example of yours of a policy initiative that has addressed a long-term issue in New Zealand, and what made that approach successful?
Yeah, well, I think I probably touched on it. So I think KiwiSaver has been a great success. I mean, wouldn't it be terrible if we didn't have it? I mean, it would be a struggle, and almost multilateral political support for KiwiSaver. If you actually talk to David Seymour, he goes, "Oh well, we're not sure we like it and ACT because." There's this sort of view from the libertarian side that people will allocate their wealth more efficiently, which I just do not buy, because I would go and buy more records and I'd do this and I'd do that. I'm supposed to be someone who thinks a lot about money, and I'm ill-disciplined. And having that KiwiSaver money come out at the start, you don't think about it. It's a bit like income tax. You pay as you pay, and you're saving away. I think has been hugely beneficial, and I think maybe. I'm not sure what the statistics would show and things, but I think there's probably a bit of a wealth effect in KiwiSaver that's keeping parts of the New Zealand economy hanging in there. When you think about how tough Auckland and Wellington are doing it, housing market is way off, and that wealth effect isn't there for people, but there will be a lot of sort of professional people 40 and up who have got a pretty healthy looking KiwiSaver balance now because of the fact that the world markets are still strong and they're growing. And so that gives you some confidence to go out and spend as well. And that's another economic benefit of saving. And so, yeah, I think, look, Sir Michael Cullen, fantastic policy initiative, and it sold it to everyone. And, we wouldn't go back now.
Yeah. And as Grant Robinson, I guess, last week said, just a shame we didn't start 30 years prior
that's right.
had an extra $1 trillion in the bank or whatever it might have been by this point. But as you say, better late than never. So you spent a lot of time thinking and writing about financial policy, economic policy. You talked at the start about the shorter attention spans, the faster pace of feedback as being one of the headwinds to making long-term policy. I wonder if you could reflect a bit more broadly about what the structural, institutional, political barriers that exist to developing policy with a horizon beyond the electoral cycle. What role, say, cross-party consensus or independent institutions or civil society could play in helping to sustain policy settings over the long term. What has made it, I guess, what does New Zealand need? Why are other countries seemingly more able to implement and maintain policy over a longer time period?
Yeah, I don't know. I guess if you look back, I mean, this will sound, I don't know how controversial this sounds. I'm still in two minds, but the Prime Minister recently brought up MMP. I don't know whether MMP has been a negative because of the structure of MMP, or whether, just thinking off the top of my head, one party has managed to hijack the system and play both sides for a number of years. But when you look at what could be done, it was less democratic. You look at what the Labour Party did in sort of 84 to 87. I guess Muldoon and National with Think Big. You're in a cabinet room. It was just your party, your guys, and it was done and decided. And people sometimes went and protested out on the streets or something. But there wasn't that sort of immediate pushback on governments, and you see now governments obviously having to manage coalition partners, and some have done it better than others. And I unfortunately, for whatever reasons, I don't think this government has been able to manage their coalition partners particularly well. And I don't necessarily think that means throwing MMP out, but you do have to look at it requires more consensus to get things done. So I guess there might be people in this group who would like to see some of the more sensible policies from national, see National and Labour work together on some big bipartisan things, because that would represent a bigger chunk of what New Zealand, mainstream New Zealand, rather than having to go to the more extreme end, or the fringe parties, or the smaller parties to achieve that. So I guess that is an issue. It's a bit. Some people will push back on the idea of those two parties, National Labour working together, though, because that is a fundamental part of democracy. And of course, it's kind of happened in Germany in the last year or so. And it's only happened because they were desperately trying to keep a hard right, party from being the sort of having the balance of power. So I guess it'd be nice if New Zealand could see a bit more of that. There are some, it's not all negative. I think there have been some positive signs. I think the leaders of Labour and National in particular are picking up from the public via commentators in the media that there is more desire for them to be a bit more bipartisan, especially about infrastructure. So there's no flip-flopping, we're not flip-flopping on infrastructure. We might see them work together on a social media ban, some of that, social policy that seems to have a fairly broad consensus with the public. So, creating pathways to achieve that within MMP, with those two parties opposing each other, but sort of also that bipartisanship and enabling them to sort of mitigate some of the handbrakes of that are there from the smaller parties. I think there are pathways there. It's just New Zealand's very small, and it works at quite a interpersonal level. It's the skills of the politicians to get in a room. A lot of times, on infrastructure, you feel like get them all in a room. You've got 7 scenarios for another Auckland Harbour crossing. Get in the room, rule out the ones that you can't work with, and then you're down to, just come out with the one that both parties can agree on, so that it can move forward across 3, 6, or 9 years.
Yeah, great. I'll try and get through 2 or 3 of the kind of structured questions that we want to put to you before about 12:30, when we'll switch over to
Sure. Yep.
5 to 10 minutes of audience Q&A. Audience, please do put some questions in there, or as I say, put a thumbs up next to the ones you would most like to see asked to Liam. So we'll start with the property market, which you referenced before. I wonder if you could just kind of zoom out a little bit here for us. So what would it mean if New Zealand property prices did not in fact return to their pre-COVID levels over the medium to long term? And also, I guess in answering that, could you also think a little bit about and explain the median salary to median house price, why that's been particularly high in New Zealand, what the I guess the economic effects that has caused. Why does property play such an important part in our economy, and what happens if the prices don't rebound in the way that we thought they might have post-COVID?
Yeah, I think there's a cultural element there, and I've looked at it in my book, Barbecue Economics. I looked at that because property is so central. It wasn't always the way, and there's a correlation, and I guess my theory is it's more than a coincidence that New Zealand investment in property, buying another house as a path to wealth, really took off about the same time as the Australian banks took over. So the mortgage lending freed up. It was pretty hard to get a mortgage in the old days, and people could, and they could maybe, they would buy a house, do it up, sell it, move on. Perhaps there was a real sort of handyman kind of vibe to the whole thing. But the idea of getting one, two, three properties and this being a pathway to wealth, you can see it in the house prices taking off from the mid 90s, which is about the time, we had the full restructuring of the banking sector. The getting a mortgage was suddenly a lot easier. I know the Reserve Bank's tried to tighten it up a little bit, but so we've had this enormous boom, but effectively I'm not the first person to say this, we're borrowing from offshore banks, effectively paying interest to them, and inflating our own house prices, selling them to each other, and it's puts an extra zero on it. Doesn't generate it generates some security for the individual, but as a whole economy, it doesn't generate real wealth, because we're still, it just increases the amount of interest that flows out to the Australian bank. So, that's happened. We saw a great, economics lesson, I guess, in a sense of, that the stimulus was done to help everyone cope with the COVID lockdowns, but record low interest rates. And actually the economy kept working pretty well. So people were able to actually keep earning, and that, extra money in the economy. We had this enormous house price boom in 21, which was an absolute bubble. And there are some people, a lot of people, people in their 30s who bought, even specifically as the second half of 2021, are really underwater now. So to some extent, the prices have reverted to pre-COVID, at least in Auckland and Wellington. I think you're talking about 40% plus or 30% plus in real inflation adjusted terms for Wellington and Auckland house price falls respectively. So that's quite big. The other thing, I think, it's the tension, and you hear it with politicians when they get asked, do they want to see house prices rise, is that there's no easy answer. We kind of like 7 years ago, we definitely wanted to see a correction. We wanted to see, we want them to be affordable, but at the same time, if you actually see a market go backwards and people are geared their whole lives towards growth in a market, you can see what happens to an economy. And I think that is Auckland's economy. So it's not just construction, it's all the services around property. Auckland has a large chunk of its economy tied to servicing properties, landscaping and roofing and tradies and things like that. They're all struggling because that market has been so down and out and flat. And so there's a real tension there. I guess I would like to see it get back to some sort of ideal level of growth where maybe just property was rising at about the rate of inflation or just above, so it was a reasonable investment. But by the same token, what we've just been through may be quite good for us in the long run, with the caveat that I feel for those people who bought at the peak. But the longer we sort of go sideways and inflation sort of drops the value of houses in real terms, the more affordable, the more that median house price to median wage equation starts to look better. And it also forces the economy to sweat, so we haven't got a property boom to create a wealth effect. Other things have to happen, which is the sort of brutal Joseph Schumpeter style economics, which is that you're going to see things go under and a lot of change. It can be a bit brutal, but it's a bit like going to the gym. It's not much fun, but you come out of this period, and we're about 4.5 years into this downturn now. So I actually think we may be seeing a cultural shift that may be long enough that previous downturns in my working life have always been there's been a sense that it's just an aberration and things will start booming again. And I'm wondering whether that's changed in New Zealand this time. And that, I think, would be a good thing.
Well, thanks. That was a really helpful answer, and you've helpfully touched on Auckland a bit in that answer. So my last question to you before we switch into the audience questions is around Auckland's role in the wider New Zealand economy. You've written on this quite a lot. I should give a shout out here to Mark Thomas, who wrote a chapter on this in our foundation's new book, Facing Up to Our Future, specifically on Auckland and its role in the New Zealand economy. If you haven't got a copy of the book, please do consider getting one. I think there's a link in the chat for you to do just that. So, how should we think about, how should New Zealand think about Auckland's role in the wider national economy? Would a greater focus on Auckland as our one global city, would that yield greater prosperity, not just for Aucklanders, but for all of New Zealand? And what might a kind of a policy framework to realize or optimize Auckland's economy look like?
Yeah, I think Auckland is a bit of a problem at the moment. And I would be open to suggestions to the accusation of being a little bit biased because I'm sitting here in the thick of it. I saw a question on the screen there from a Gary Moore, who I wondered if was former mayor Gary Moore, my old buddy from St Albans days in Christchurch. I'm a Cantabrian who's lived in Auckland for 30 odd years, and I look at what's happening in Christchurch, all the stats and everything with some envy, I guess, right now. But you can't get away from the fact, unfortunately, that Auckland is like 38% of GDP. I mean, it's such a large chunk of New Zealand's population, and it's a gateway. It's sort of the place where immigrants tend to land in Auckland, and so while Auckland's down and out, I guess the overall national statistics aren't going to look that flash. I guess I couldn't pretend to tell you how things are going in Christchurch. In the core of the thing, I see the stats and I get anecdotes from friends and family, and my sense from friends and family working in small business is that it's still not absolutely like boom times. The agricultural sector's been fantastic in Christchurch, and parts of their country are more connected to the agricultural sector and doing better. But I think Auckland is quite detached from the agricultural sector, and that's meant that we're not seeing money flowing into the economy. It has to come from other places, really, and that's where it needs to come from. The financial sector and financial investment. If it's not coming from our old favourites, just boosted migration and then a property bubble, and those the migration and property have flattered Auckland's economy, and probably by default flattered New Zealand's economy for some years prior to COVID. And maybe the rest of the country was feeling it. I remember Shamabeel Yacob talking about zombie towns. Well, I'm not sure he is now. I think he's talking about those towns that were struggling, looking pretty good. Because when I started as a business journalist, there was a view that food commodities were on the way out, and that it was an ever decreasing graph of value for them, and that has not been the case. We do have parts of the country that must be doing quite well, but there isn't great research out there, I'd have to say, about how money flows from our export economy into cities like Auckland and Wellington. So if anyone's a impending PhD student in economics, it would be great to have someone looking at that transfer of wealth from the export economy to the urban economy in New Zealand, because how long should it take? What are the sort of pathways there? I'm not sure, but I think I remain optimistic to come back to Auckland that in a few more years there will be cranes over the skyline again, and it will be humming again. It's too amazing. It's an amazing city. I don't think the CRL will fix all its problems. It might be a longer burn than that, but New Zealand will have to get a reasonable pace of immigration going again, just to cover the kind of skills shortages and things, and there will be some property growth. It won't be as bad as it's been, but hopefully by the time that happens, we'll also have a city that's got a few more strings to its bow.
Great, thanks, Liam. We're a little late getting on to audience Q&A, so if you can stick around
Sorry.
for
Yeah, I can.
5 minutes through
Yep,
through to
absolutely. Yep.
12:45, we'll try and get through a few of these questions. Thank you to everyone who's asked questions. And perhaps, Liam, proving latent demand for financial journalists to reflect on productivity more than they currently do. Our most popular question comes in here from Robert. Hi, Liam, after 30 years observing New Zealand's economy, what is the single biggest mistake successive governments have made in failing to lift productivity, and how would you fix it?
Oof, yeah. Um, there's an interesting one. I mean, as I mentioned, there's, like there's some really obvious businessy ones, like, our investment in R&D is well down. But then you also, yeah, so investing in R&D, financial literacy, entrepreneurship, there's that whole thread, which I absolutely agree with. But I think, and this is not me just sort of being a bleeding heart liberal, but when you look at the inequality in New Zealand society, and even just walking into work through Queen Street and the homeless people you see, there are, we know there is a kind of sort of almost an underclass of people who are just not achieving in society. Now, consider the impact of, if those people were fully engaged in different forms of work, and so in a way, dealing with inequality and a more inclusive economy, I think would be a big piece of the puzzle in terms of lifting productivity, because we're just wasting so much human capital. And in fact, it's the opposite, that those people become a drain, social welfare, and they're, inevitably going to be unhealthier and all those things. So there's a sort of a gain to making sure that you carry a larger chunk of people with you in the sort of wealth creation journey, and it's sort of a virtuous circle, because people who are productive and involved in wealth creation cost the government less, and they start to employ. And yeah, I think it is quite sad that there's been, no doubt, there's plenty of effort over the years, but we have not really cracked this issue of poverty and inequality, because it still seems to be getting worse. And maybe if we frame it as a sort of one of the key pillars of our productivity failure, that might be another way of looking at it, that brings sort of more people on board, rather than just sort of the sheer sort of sympathy for people's lot.
Thanks, Liam. And I have to say, fascinatingly, that fully half of the questions I've scanned through refer to productivity in some way or another.
Yeah, well,
Uh,
it's good to hear. Heartening. Um, yeah, I mean, it's sort of like sometimes I just have to write around the word. Yeah, but I
sure.
think I'm sure we've got a very engaged audience here today.
Yeah, well, yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. Whether or not our foundation's webinar audience is representative of the wider New Zealand audience is another
Well, I
question.
think the themes are relevant. Just sometimes the word and the way it's presented in the media can seem pretty dry, but I think those themes around, creating wealth and doing it in an inclusive way are pretty universal. So, yeah.
Absolutely. So we'll step away from productivity for a second. We've got a question from Paul Minute. Is there some new policy opportunity that New Zealand could take that would be new and unique and give New Zealand a boost in wealth? What is the likely sector this could arrive in? I don't know what your thoughts are on this, but it's been interesting to see the development of an aerospace industry in New Zealand over the past decade and a half, or however long it's been, to the point where New Zealand now has a space agency. But interested in your thoughts on that question.
Yeah, never would have picked that growing up, but I'm old enough that I never would have picked we'd have a Hollywood-based film industry either. So it was a pretty thin, and I think I'd like to see us sort of the technology industry, but it's the creative end of it. I think New Zealanders are really creative. I've been to China and talked to people about the education system there. They are very jealous of the way, and I hope we're maintaining this, but we bring kids up to be quite creative thinkers relative to the rest of the world, and quite, and so we have this really strong creative streak in New Zealand. And to me, it's sort of like the missing piece of the puzzle is connecting it to commercializing it, which sounds a bit harsh, but it's about how you can make a living out of it. A Peter Beck or a Peter Jackson, they've made that connection. I could probably, if I looked them up, I could find there's video game developers doing that sort of thing now, and it's a really promising industry. And it sort of is the answer to the question of what are our kids going to do other than leave for Australia or the UK or wherever, because as much as you hear Shane Jones or someone talk about, oh, we could, up our mining. It's a very extractive industry. It doesn't create. It might create some wealth if we struck lithium or something. I don't know, but I don't think it's going to create the kind of large scale jobs, number of jobs that we want our kids to be doing and want New Zealanders to be engaged in. And I think, it's a sort of combination of creativity, which probably has to link to both technology and to some extent our entrepreneurship. So I think we haven't been a hugely entrepreneurial nation in the sense that the way I grew up was just not thinking that way. There's a small, great small business people in New Zealand, but it's changed in 20 years. It's starting to improve, and I think in a funny sort of way, young kids being locked out of the housing market, I see them thinking differently about investing and about doing things and how they're going to make their way. They're not necessarily thinking they're going to have a job for 30 years in one place. So, but that entrepreneurship, when you can combine it with tech savvy people, which we have, with really great creative thinking that we have, just pulling that together, I think the threads are there. That would be my pathway for an industry beyond sort of agriculture, mining, primary sector.
Yeah, great. Well, by popular demand, returning to a productivity question, we've got a really good question here from Charles Dashfield on the various factors that may have contributed to New Zealand's low productivity. He lists a few, and I guess perhaps, Liam, if you want to pick one or two that you think have been most important here. It's foreign ownership of New Zealand business, such as forestry. Is it property as the main only form of savings? Is it lack of government legislation mandating a higher proportion of wages as retirement savings? Is it privatizing of industries that have led to unrealistic dividends and asset stripping? He's cited the example here of New Zealand Rail Network. And then finally, potential short-termism leading to flip-flopping on policy. So there are some potential.
I do think our property obsession for the past sort of 30 odd years, certainly up until say 21, sort of 90s through that has been a problem. I think I'm less hung up on national ownership. I'm just into the idea of ownership. So investing in the capital, you'll get the right amount of capital invested in New Zealand, and you'll get more capital coming in if we have a base of capital. I caught up with some guys from BlackRock, which I'm sure your listeners will have heard of. They probably don't love them because they're a giant Wall Street bank, but the Australasian guys, and they're just talking about the money in Australia. That savings in a savings pool in Australia gives the international capital confidence to come in and to invest in Australia because they know it's backed by local money, and that gets all sorts of things going infrastructure wise, and you can have so whether it's partial privatization or privatization, things can be privately owned, private, but still largely locally owned, or it's all balanced up by the fact that, we own a certain amount of an airport because we think that's the right investment mix, but we also own an investment in an airport somewhere else in the world and somewhere else in the world, and the dividends will flow back into the country. So, I just think, capital and what comes with it, which says is that twin virtues of saving because you're going to be individually richer and there's a wealth effect, and saving because it creates a pool of capital for New Zealand-based finance groups to invest locally and internationally is just so virtuous.
Yeah, great. All right, last question then. one of the I think most effective long-term actors in the New Zealand economy in recent decades has been Māori business and some of the large iwi actors in our economy. I wonder if you've got any thoughts on the Māori economy and its relationship to the wider New Zealand economy.
Yeah, well, I mean, you come back to maybe to finish up on this idea of short-term versus long-term thinking. I think there's something to be learned there, right? You've seen, three or four of the major iwi become real economic powerhouses. So Tainui, Ngāti Whātua, Ngāi
No time.
Tahu, and they've kind of they are taking a long-term investment mix. Ngāti Toa, I think, is Wellington. Um, you know, uh, so so, and it almost seems sort of like poetic, but they've realized that let's start with land. So there's been a lot of property investment and land investment, so buying back land which was lost. Um, but the long-term thinking that goes into the iwi decision making doesn't seem to be hurting them financially. I would make that observation anyway. So I think perhaps there is something to be learnt there. And actually, if you look across at our friends in China and the way they do their investing, and even some of the Americans are pretty snappy, but there are the big investment funds that long-term thinking does pay off. Your Warren Buffett's, people like that. And so yeah, I would say when we look at the iwi and how well they're doing, maybe we should think about learning something from that mentality. Yeah, that long-term mentality.
Liam, thank you so much for your time today. This is exactly the kinds of conversations we're looking to have. We really appreciate you making some time. Thank you all for joining our conversation today. As I mentioned at the start, we'll have former leader of the National Party, former Transport Minister Simon Bridges joining us later in September. I think that'll be 29th September, and I think we'll have an announcement of another webinar before that as well. But until then, thank you all very much for joining us and enjoy the rest of your Wednesday.